Hello, everyone. We are back again for a new series of Call My Supervisor, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. You know the format by now, but for those who are new, in this series we'll be speaking to doctoral candidates from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. My name is Daniel Mansfield. I'm the Communications Officer for the School of Politics and Economics, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest for this episode, Claire Burchett, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of European and International Studies. Claire, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
A pleasure. So let's make a start, and I'm going to ask you please to introduce your research and give us the title and a very brief overview.
Sure. My preliminary title is Everyday Victimhood on Social Media, the Framing of Jews and Anti-Semitism in the Populist Radical Right Online Space in France, Germany, and Austria. And my research is looking at three populist radical right parties. So the National Rally in France, the Alternative for Germany in Germany, and the Freedom Party of Austria in Austria. And I'm looking at their posts on Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, and how they talk about Jews, anti-Semitism, and Israel. So the reason I'm doing this is that all three parties, even though they're from the far right, which has historically been anti-Semitic, all three parties now claim to be kind of anti-Semitic, to be very pro kind of Jewish rights, pro-Israel, etc. And I think the starting point of my PhD was to just discover whether that was the case or not and how that is reflected on social media. And my thesis for my PhD is basically arguing that these three parties create their in-group, their kind of online communities as communities of victims, and that Jews are included as long as their victimhood is kind of conducive to these parties' ideological messaging. And as a second part to that research, I'm also looking at how users who engage with these party posts respond and react to these party narratives, so whether they agree or not.
Okay, so is this a comparative analysis? Or what sort of methods are at play here?
Yeah, so it is a comparative analysis. I'm looking at the three parties, the three countries, and the two platforms. I'm comparing all of those things. And I know that the party posts, I analysed them using qualitative methods. So I use something called discourse historical analysis, which is originally conceptualized by an Austrian linguist called Ruth Wodak. And she looks specifically at kind of how the in-group and the out-group is constructed. So I looked at these party posts and I did this qualitative analysis of looking at how these parties frame the in-group and the out-group and whether Jews are included or not. And for the user comments, there were obviously a lot more of those, I think over 40,000 in total. So I used more quantitative methods. So I did a topic model on these comments, and I also did a kind of word frequency analysis using Python. So looking at a broader overview of how these users respond to these narratives. And then to finalize that, I did an inductive content analysis, which is something more qualitative, but I needed that quantitative analysis to get to that point. So I just filtered the data sets using specific keywords, and then I inductively coded them. So I tried to kind of figure out what these users, how they were reacting and what the prominent narratives were.
Okay, so let's talk about the day-to-day of your research. Then you sit down at your desk. Maybe we have to go a little bit back in time to, when you were into the meat of the research. You take these social media posts, how do you collect them, and then what do you do with them?
Yeah, so the social media data collection was probably one of the more turbulent aspects of this PhD. The social media APIs are kind of increasingly difficult to access for researchers. The Facebook one was shut down in 2018, so a while back. And I tried to contact kind of alternative, maybe third-party companies who specialize in collecting Facebook data, but no one responded to me, probably because I'm quite small fry and had not a lot of money to offer them. But I ended up just manually collecting the Facebook posts. So I would search specific keywords that I was looking for into party profiles and just collect the posts, kind of manually copying them into Word documents. And then for X, which was Twitter when I started the PhD, obviously quite a big change happened. I started in 2021, and in 2022, Elon Musk took over Twitter. and progressively kind of shut down the API and how researchers collect that data. So in early 2023, I found out that the researcher API that I'd spent a summer school kind of learning how to use was going to be shut down, and kind of frantically tried to collect as much data as possible. And I don't know if it's because it was in a period of transition, but this data collection wasn't actually very consistent when I did kind of manual checks afterwards. So I ended up finishing it off manually and also using another kind of third-party site, which came up later in 2024, I think, to scrape the remaining user comments and the remaining posts. So yeah, quite fragmented and not ideal, but also kind of not really entirely my fault, I would say.
Has it been a labor intensive experience, that sort of data collection, the copy and pasting, the coding?
Yeah, massively. I think that probably was maybe the thing that took me the longest time. And I like to think that if I'd been able to collect that data more conventionally through a kind of user for a researcher API, maybe I would have saved maybe like 6 months from the PhD, because going back and having to check and manually copying and pasting, that took a really long time. So thankfully this third party website came up that worked really well, and that helped me save a lot of time, to be honest, like towards the end. But everything else, the analysis was also more interesting, but also, yeah, maybe took a bit less time.
Okay, so what about this subject interests you? Why did you pick it over any others? Did it link to your master's, or is this just a new direction you've gone in?
Yeah, it massively linked to my master's. So my BA was in German and Russian, and I'm also half French. So I had a kind of background in a lot of interest in European politics and history. I've always been a massive history nerd, and I think that really helped as well. And so for my master's, I did a master's in European studies here at King's. And when it came to writing my thesis, I didn't see myself going into academia. I saw myself actually working for the EU. So you see how that panned out. So I kind of thought this thesis is for me, like I just want to write it on something that I find interesting. And I think the way that politicians deal with the past and the way they, instrumentalize the past is always something that's really interested me. So originally it was going to be about how the EU now talks about the Holocaust and how they've kind of used that. And then eventually I narrowed it down to looking at the far right in France and Germany. And yeah, so I wrote my thesis on that in 2019. And very luckily, very fortunately, my then supervisor and now supervisor, Katrin Schreiter, said that it could be a good idea to expand it into a PhD. So I got very lucky, and kind of that was my route into then thinking maybe I should do a PhD out of this. And I think that was something I'd always wanted to do in the back of my mind, but it was quite nice to receive that validation that this could be a good project. Yeah, I think so. It was just a combination of history and the far right. I find very interesting. Obviously, they're in the news a lot. They were in the news a lot at the time in 2019 and haven't really gone away. So I think that boosted me as well to see this as quite a relevant and topical thing to talk about. And I think then finally, this aspect of, I talk a lot about victimhood identities in my PhD, and I find this idea of this concept of victimhood fascinating as well. This kind of idea that victimhood has become a real part of identity politics, and how people want to be victims and want to be seen as victims, and how they kind of reclaim that for themselves. So yeah, I that was probably those are the main things that I found interesting about it.
Okay, so this has been mostly desk based. Is that fair to say? Your methods?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so how did you go about that on day one? Did you have to teach yourself something new? Did you sit down with your supervisor and say, where do I go from here? How does it work?
Yeah, it was quite a long process because I think I wasn't always sure which direction to go in. And, originally I was going to look at kind of conventional media as well, which I ended up discarding because it was maybe too ambitious. I think the main thing I've really had to get to grips with and learn is coding in this PhD. So I did a summer school in 2022 at the end of my first year. That would be, yeah, at the end of my first year, 2 weeks in Essex, and found it really challenging, to be honest. I'm not a natural coder. I'm more of a kind of arts and humanities person. And then I ended up kind of not really using what I'd learned in that summer school because, sorry, in the summer school, I learned how to use R and how to use this Twitter API that I mentioned. And then eventually that wasn't relevant anymore. So I ended up using Python instead, because I actually found it a lot more user friendly. And got a lot of help from a friend, to be honest, who was a lot more adept at programming than I was. So yeah, I would say that's the main thing I really had to learn and get to grips with in the PhD.
How is your Python?
Comes and goes. I think I think it's all right. I know now how to do the research methods that I wanted to do, and I find it a fascinating tool in terms of what it can do and how you can analyze data with it. So things like the topic model, things like collecting data on quite a large scale, doing a word frequency analysis, doing a filtered data set, I did a lot of my graphs using Python, so kind of looking at the frequency of posts over time, using specific keywords, for example. I find the possibilities that you have with Python kind of endless and fascinating. I think I just don't feel always super confident, but it's definitely something I want to kind of continue using and maybe continue developing my own skills in for sure.
So how can AI assist with that, or can it assist with your Python? Can it help with coding? Can you just ask it to produce something for you? Does it not have a role at all, or do you prefer to just do it manually to keep your experience and your techniques up with Python?
I feel like this is a bit of a taboo question. Who admits to using AI? I mean, I think a bit of both. When I first started using Python, things like ChatGPT didn't exist, so I was using a lot of a lot of online forums, to be honest, a lot of Google searches, kind of how do I convert a string into a list, for example. And there's a kind of whole community of people online who are willing to help you. Um, since ChatGPT's existence, I would be lying if I said I haven't kind of used it occasionally, especially with particularly challenging things, or when your code's not working for some reason and you've spent 2 hours on it and you're just about to tear your hair out and wondering why it's not working. I've definitely, put the code into ChatGPT and asked it what's happening, and it's been really, really helpful. But yeah, I do try and do the more organic method of figuring it out by myself for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about your findings and anything that's surprised you or stood out for you so far, or maybe defied your expectations, or maybe it's just fit with what you thought it would.
In terms of my findings, I would say it's difficult to answer that question because they're so kind of embedded in my mind at this point. I can't even remember what I expected to find at the beginning. I think they conformed to a lot of what the literature was saying. So a lot of the literature was arguing, that these parties still, minimize Jewish victimhood when they talk about things like the Holocaust, but that they will overtly talk about Jewish victimhood when they want to legitimize their Islamophobia or legitimize their anti-government criticism. So a big narrative that all three parties will use is arguing that the government has been really incompetent in combating what they call Muslim Arab anti-Semitism. So this amalgamation of Muslims, immigrants, radical Islamists into this kind of other that they use to blame all contemporary anti-Semitism on. And that had already started to appear in the literature, so it wasn't really a surprise. I guess, and then on the flip side, these parties do continue to use what the literature considers as, anti-Semitic code words, things like talking about George Soros or talking about globalists, talking about Rothschild. Not many parties actually talked about the latter. I think maybe it's seen as too overt now. I would say maybe one surprising finding was the Austrian far right's slightly more ambivalent approach to Israel, for example. So in France and Germany, they are very overtly supportive of everything that Israel does, whereas in Austria, they are actually quite critical in anti-Semitic terms, using kind of classic anti-Semitic tropes to talk about Israel's influence on Austrian policy, for example. So that was quite an interesting finding and a surprising finding. And then I think also the way that Holocaust remembrance is used to kind of normalize these parties. So it's become something that the EU feels very strongly about, rightfully so, and is kind of widely commemorated across the EU. And I found that in Austria and in France, when the parties were doing well electorally, they would post more about Holocaust remembrance. So that was quite an interesting finding as well. And then I would say maybe a final finding that I found really interesting was analyzing these user comments. I think I expected to find a lot more kind of over anti-Semitism in the user comments, because a lot of the literature was saying, that discourse radicalizes when it's not in these kind of official posts. So the comments will always be more radical. But actually, I found that a lot of the sentiment towards Jewish people was through the lens of victimhood. So either through a defensive victimhood, so kind of really resenting feeling accused of anti-Semitism, even when that wasn't there, and also a competitive victimhood. So kind of when the parties would say, we need to protect Jews from Muslim Arab anti-Semitism, the comments would say, why not Christians? Why not white people? And in France, actually, there was even why not Muslims, which was a difference. I think maybe because of the larger Muslim community in France potentially. So yeah, that was quite an interesting finding.
How has the discourse changed, or indeed has it changed from, the earliest posts that you've been looking at to perhaps the more recent ones? Have attitudes changed as you've gone, and how do they link across borders? Do they mirror each other as they've changed, or are they slightly different?
I would say that there's no kind of broader pattern in terms of how the three parties differ and how they're similar. I think they have changed since, so the time frame I was looking at was 2017 to early 2023. And I think they change with the different parties' electoral success, to be honest. So, for example, at the beginning of that time frame, the FPÖ in Austria was in government. So they were doing quite a lot of, what I've mentioned previously. They were talking about Holocaust remembrance. They were being quite respectful. And that's really changed since they left government in 2019. So they just talk about the topic a lot less. They find it a lot less interesting. And what they talked about the most was blaming Israel for Austrian COVID policy, for example, which wasn't seen in the other parties. That was a purely Austrian phenomenon. And then, on the flip side, in France, I would say that, Marine Le Pen in France is, quite widely established in the literature that she's really undertaken a very kind of conscientious policy of kind of demonization of the party. So she wants the party to be seen as more moderate and more softer in its presentation. And that's really visible in the party posts. So even the difference between 2017 and 2018. So the party doesn't talk about Soros after 2018, for example. They don't criticize the main kind of Jewish representative organization in France after 2018. And the National Rally had quite a significant electoral success in June 2022 in the legislative elections. And after that, you can really see their discourse like polishing up. So they talk a lot more about Holocaust remembrance. They present themselves a lot more as a party as a kind of party that could be in government, for example. So yeah, I would say those are the main differences that I noticed, but the kind of final analysis is kind of yet to be completed. So I will maybe get back to you on that.
Okay, so on that subject, then, what's left for you to do? How far along are you in the process?
So I've just finished a first draft of the thesis, which I was quite happy with. And right now I'm waiting to receive feedback from that thesis. So I'm not sure what the outcome will be, how much longer I will have to kind of do the edits. And right now I'm kind of looking at potentially trying to publish some of my findings in a journal article. That's kind of my main focus at the moment while I'm waiting for feedback.
So the feedback process is a waiting game. Is there anything that you can do?
There are definitely bits that so I'm waiting because it's quite a long document. So when I sent it, it stood at about 98,000 words. 7,000 of which is a bibliography, but still it's quite a hefty thing to get through. And yeah, so I have to give my supervisors, who obviously have kind of parallel workloads, the time to get through the whole thing. And what I've been doing in the meantime, related to the PhD, is, as I mentioned, I did this inductive coding of the user comments. So obviously that is qualitative, so it's open to a researcher bias. So I've been going through those again to make sure that I still agree with how I've coded the user comments, and then I'll apply the changes if there are any to the thesis when I get the edits back.
Just before we wrap up for the first half, what impact have bots had on your work? Have you noticed them? Are they prevalent? Are they non-existent in the work you've been looking at?
So I haven't really given them a huge role in the thesis, to be honest, because I would say for two reasons. I have noticed potential bot posts, especially in the user comments, particularly when I find that, posts are being repeated across different posts, or they're very, very long and they kind of say the same thing and they're very nonsensical. And they, often with the spread of things like conspiracy theories, that comes from bots. Whereas I feel like it's quite obvious when it's a real person because the comments will be quite emotional and they'll be quite personal. They'll say, things like, I've got a grandfather who, which maybe that's just me being naive, but I feel like that's less likely to be bots. And then the second thing is that I've anonymized all the user comments. So I haven't spent much time looking into things like names or things like profiles of users because for ethical reasons, I anonymized everything. So it's even if there are bots in there, I haven't really pointed them out or noticed them because regardless of whether they kind of warp the research, my aim was to get a kind of holistic understanding of the populist radical rights online space, bots and all. So I feel like it's still kind of necessary and relevant to look at.
Fantastic. Claire, thank you so much for your reflections. That's going to bring an end to part one. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we're going to speak to Claire about her personal experience of the PhD. We'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us. In the first half, we spoke to Claire about her PhD research and her research methods. And in this second half, we're going to talk more about the PhD experience. So, Claire, can you tell us what attracted you to take on a PhD in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I mentioned in the first half, I've always been, quite a nerdy person. I think I find these phenomena and what's happening in the world very interesting and how it relates back to kind of European history for sure. And I always enjoyed studying, so I really enjoyed my BA, I really enjoyed my MA. So I think in the back of my mind, I always thought maybe I would come back and do a PhD. But I thought maybe I should go out and get a proper job, maybe with some. Not that PhD isn't a proper job, but you know what I mean. I think I come from a non-academic background family, so they've always been very supportive of me, but they were kind of encouraging me to maybe get some office experience, some corporate experience, which I did do. Um, and yeah, I think when my master's supervisor reached out to me, suggesting making the project into a PhD, it just felt like a kind of sign that maybe I should really try and pursue it, and that it was, if I had a good idea for a project, that it was as good a time as any to try and do it. So yeah, it's quite an unconventional route. I appreciate it's not the most relatable thing ever, but yeah.
Okay, so how has the process been different to your expectations, or indeed, was it different to your expectations?
That's interesting. What were my expectations? I guess.
So, for example, some people say that the BA and the MA is very directed and that there's a structure to it. Whereas when you land on day one of the PhD, it's kind of like a job in that you have to direct yourself and that you have to set your own
Mm.
agenda. And that came as a surprise to them, or at least it was a stark change. Can you identify with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think because I'd had 18 months of working I was working in a business intelligence company over COVID and that, and I think that break from academia was actually a really good thing for me. I think it really improved my writing, for example. I think my writing became very concise and not as waffly. That's just a side note from my personal experience. So I don't know if it was maybe a break from expectation in terms of not being as directed, but I definitely have found that in terms of, for the BA and the MA, you do have a lot of support and they're taught. So like what the expectations are of you. You have to do a specific assessment at the end. And I felt like the PhD, often my supervisors have given me a lot of support, but ultimately it's my decision. And I find that quite stressful because I don't always trust my own decisions. So I think it's sometimes, and also, I've had camaraderie with the other PhDs and we've often bounced ideas off each other, but ultimately we're not working on the same things. So I think that's maybe what I've, yeah, found slightly challenging sometimes is just the question of, where do I go from here? What research method do I use? What is the right thing to do? and then ultimately just having to kind of try things out and change my mind, and not having anyone to kind of be like, okay, this is what we're doing, because that's not what the PhD is about. But I think that's sometimes what I wanted.
Okay, so you touched on challenges there. What's helped you during that process? Perhaps a person, a thing, a website, or is it a amalgamation of different things that have proven particularly useful?
So I probably have two answers to that question, and they're both maybe slightly embarrassing. I would say the first thing that helped me was kind of remembering why I was doing the project in the first place, and kind of going back to the roots of what I found interesting about it. So whenever I would feel a bit kind of jaded by it, I would always try and, take a couple of days off, and then maybe just start again by reading some existing research about the topic, or reading my notes or something, kind of moving away from what I was trying to do and looking at what had already been done and the ideas that were established and what interested me about it. And I think finding that spark again was really helpful for me, especially later on in the project. And then the second thing that really helped me, is just the PhD community at King's. I think that was maybe one expectation I had, to go back to your previous question. I thought that it would be quite an isolating experience, because that's what everyone said to me before I started the PhD. They were all like, "Oh, you're going to be really lonely, or you're going to find it really difficult because you're going to be on your own a lot." And I've just found the opposite to be true. I think I got so lucky with my intake and my cohort. I think coming into the office often has just been such a help to kind of get myself out of my own head, and making some really very good friends out of the PhD experience. Not just at King's, actually, even at conferences and at summer schools. I've met some really, really wonderful people, and who've obviously had the shared experience of the PhD, and that's really just helped me an enormous amount. I don't know how I would have done it without those people, so I'm very grateful to them.
You touched on isolation there, and that is one of the themes that's come up several times in the series that we've done. Not so much a problem for you, not much of a challenge for you. So what have you found challenging?
I think maybe the social isolation hasn't been an issue, but like the professional isolation has felt quite difficult. Um, which has been helped by having these friends around me and having this support. But I still have had moments, maybe I'm contradicting myself now. I think socially I've not felt like I've been lacking friends, for example, but have sometimes felt like, I've wanted like someone to tell me what to do. Or I think another thing I've found very difficult is, I feel like you often, especially in such a crowded field like researching the far right and populism, where there's a lot of incredibly capable people looking at these phenomena who are coming up with all these brilliant ideas all the time. And you just wonder, what is my place in this field? And do I have anything good to say that hasn't been said already? So yeah, I think that has often been a struggle of mine. So especially when things, happen in the news, and I've thought, oh, maybe I should write something about that. And then I've gone on Twitter and I've seen that someone's already written a blog post, and I'm just like, oh, okay, fine. Well, maybe not then. And similarly, I think, you have this idea, and then a few times I thought that I was being super original, and then I would find, a published article with similar methods or similar themes, and I would just feel really like kind of defeated and feel like, what's the point of my research? Um, yeah, I would say that those are quite challenging things, and especially maybe deep in the periods of data collection, just finding it, when you don't have a kind of end result yet, you don't know what the analysis is going to show, you don't know if it's going to be very interesting or very relevant, and you're just collecting this data in the hope that you're going to have something to show for it. That's quite difficult, because you wonder, like, am I just wasting my time? So yeah, I would say that those are maybe some of the challenges that I'm sure aren't unique to me either. I'm sure lots of people will struggle with those things.
So what advice would you give to firstly yourself 3 years ago, on day one of your PhD? If you could give some advice to yourself, what would you say?
And well, firstly, I would tell myself exactly what methods to use and how to do it, so that I could
Very
save a lot of time. Yeah. Um, I would maybe say that even if, other people are writing on similar things to you, it doesn't mean that you don't have anything good to say. And that you will always be able to find another angle, I think is quite important to remember. And also just to, I think this is maybe really cliche, but I really strongly believe it. I think in academia, there's a lot of kind of front-facing confidence and a lot of maybe bravado, a lot of people who do know a lot about their topic and don't really show any weakness. And I think what's always helped me the most is talking to other PhDs or postdocs, mostly early career researchers, to be honest, and just be having honest conversations about how difficult it can be. And that's been really, really helpful, to be honest. And I would probably go back and say, trust in those connections that you'll make and don't be afraid to be honest. And one of the things that I'm really like proud of that I've done during the PhD is trying to kind of spread that attitude. So, we did a summer school at King's, which was organised by Isabel, my supervisor, and we did a kind of session in that PhD where we talked about in that summer school, sorry, where we talked about managing the PhD challenges and opportunities. And we just had a really honest conversation, and there was no academic staff in the room. It was all PhDs and people who'd just finished their PhD. And it was really heartwarming to see kind of there were people at that summer school who were just starting. And I was in my second or third year by that point, I think third year. And it was really nice to see people kind of scribbling notes down and scribbling advice down and saying afterwards that they found it really helpful. And I've gone off a bit of a tangent, I appreciate, but I think, yeah, that's one of the things I would go back and tell myself is like you will find people who feel the same way as you, and you're not the only one who feels that way. And ultimately, I mean, I don't know, I haven't got my feedback from my draft yet, but I like to think that, everything will turn out okay in the end.
So on that same token, then, what advice would you give to someone who's thinking about applying? Would you advocate perhaps for some time in the private sector, or quotes regular job, or would you say just dive in, or what would you say to someone who's thinking about applying?
I would say, based on my own experience, I did find a break from academia really helpful, but I know that a lot of people go straight from the master's to the PhD and do really well. So I would say that that's quite a personal decision. I think if you're feeling like you want a change of scene and you want to do something a bit different for a while, maybe a different style of writing, different kind of people that you might mix with, I'm very grateful for the fact that, I went traveling for a little bit and I worked for 18 months, even though it was mostly home working. So I didn't really get the kind of office experience. And then, I would say the classic bits of advice, I think. I obviously went through quite like an unrelatable route in terms of choosing my supervisor, but I think it is important to try and have a rapport with your supervisor, to maybe try and meet them at least once before you do the PhD application, just to know that you feel comfortable with them, because I think that makes such a difference. To have a maybe quite frank conversation about how they work, about whether they want to micromanage a student or whether they want to just leave a student to their own devices, because everyone's different and some people need kind of constant reassurance and validation. And I may or may not be one of those people, but other people maybe want to be left alone and just to figure it out by themselves. And I think it's important to work that out before you start. And then I think the most important thing, honestly, is to just make sure that you find the subject endlessly fascinating. And because you're going to be stuck with it for at least 3 to 4 years, you're going to have to know it inside out and back to front, or at least be kind of so immersed in it that you feel like that's the case. And yeah, and I think sometimes you really hate it and you're so bored of it, but I think that it's really important to know that there are different aspects to it, and maybe this is where things like interdisciplinarity comes in. So, if the politics side of it is annoying you, you can look more at the psychological side or the historical side, for example. I know that's really helped me. And actually, I know that I said that was my final bit of advice, but my final bit of advice, which reflects on what I said that I would say to myself, is probably also just to really try and find that community if that is what you think might help you. Obviously, some people don't need it as much, but it really helped me. And I think the only way I got it was by making sure that I came into the office regularly, that I kind of made an effort to chat to people and to make those connections and to, go to conferences and to be brave enough to approach people at the end of their panels if you feel like you could have a connection with them. I've made so many good connections out of doing that and just being brave and confident. And it's not always easy because those things don't come naturally, but I think it really does pay off. So I would, yeah, give that as my kind of rambling, sporadic advice.
So, can you leave this all behind when you're done with the PhD and go and do something else? Do you want to keep running with this? What's your grander plan, if indeed there is one?
Um, my grand plan. So I'm going to try and get an academic job, which obviously is very, very competitive and very difficult, but I think I'm going to give it a go. But I'm also not shutting myself off to other opportunities. So at the moment, because I'm not kind of jobless, I'm still, I'm teaching here at King's until the end of term, for example, and I'm still, I'm far from finished with the PhD. So um, but I'm starting to look at jobs and maybe look at postdocs and potentially jobs in think tanks. That's kind of my alternative route, I think, because especially with a background in looking at the far right and researching extremism, I think that could be a potential good opportunity for me. But yeah, I'm just trying to keep an open mind, to be honest. I think that's the only way to go about it, because I think if you get stuck on wanting to stay in a particular place or wanting a particular job, then I think it can be quite difficult because academia is, yeah, very competitive, and the best way to go about it is just, yeah, have an open mind.
Okay, so to wrap up then, let's talk about the PhD community in the department or in the school in SPE. What's it been like for you?
So yeah, as I mentioned, it's been really great. I think I got very lucky with the cohort that I joined with, that we all, get on very well, and that we, started going for drinks outside of work, probably, in our first years. So that's just been really nice, just to have, a community who are kind of doing the same thing as you. And yeah, I would say the staff have by and large been very helpful as well. I mainly communicate with my supervisors, but I've also done some teaching, so I've worked with some other members of academic staff, and they've always been helpful. Um, yeah, and there are kind of social occasions as well, organised by the department, which have always been nice. So there's, yeah, been lots of opportunities to mingle and to meet people, definitely.
And where can we find all the PhDs on a Wednesday afternoon? Where's the PhD pub? Is that a trade secret or
Wednesday afternoon will be hard at work. No, I think we're very open-minded in terms of our pub selection, I would say. I think it really depends, but I think the common pub that was the most frequented, and like where my Monzo told me I'd spent most of my money last year, was the Edgar Wallace. But I also quite like Temple Brew House as well. But people find that it's more controversial as a choice because it's underground, so people don't like the lack of natural light. But personally, I have a preference for it.
fair enough? That's a great note to end on. I'd like to thank Claire for sharing her thoughts and insights for this episode. And of course, thanks also to you, our listeners, for taking the time to tune in. We look forward to welcoming you again soon for our next episode. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.